Story 1. When Duolingo took over my family. It started out as something so harmless, almost endearing, a little game my parents took up after my dad retired. Something to pass the time, they said. They were learning Spanish, picking up words and phrases on Duolingo, just to keep their minds nimble, they assured me. In the beginning, it was mostly just for laughs. Donde, esta, bano, they'd shout across the house, and my mother would try out her accent, slipping bits of Spanish into her texts, and we'd all smile and shake our heads. But before long, the game started to take on a life of its own. They became dedicated, then obsessed, with keeping their streaks intact, collecting points, moving up those digital leaderboards. Each morning, the first thing they'd do was grab their phones, as though the world outside had narrowed to the glow of the little green owl, pushing them on, one lesson at a time. They'd brag to me about reaching new leagues, their voices taking on this competitive edge I'd never heard from them before. And then there were the gems, virtual currency, but they guarded it like gold. Suddenly, family dinners were rescheduled, weekend plans debated over, all in service of these precious double points hours. It was like Duolingo had seeped into our family without any of us noticing. We couldn't sit around the table without talk drifting to their classmates on the app, or who was topping the leaderboard, who was outpacing whom. I couldn't escape it. The constant dings of their phones followed me even when I wasn't there. And worse, it started creeping into my dreams, grammar drills echoing in my head, the cheerful jingle announcing my parents' ascent into yet another league. The green owl was everywhere now. Its wide, staring eyes began to feel less like a friendly coach and more like an omnipresent force, watching over us with a relentless grin. I started picturing scenarios in which they'd begun to barter with the game gems or translate my future grandchild's name into Spanish as if it were just another lesson. It was ridiculous, yet somehow the idea didn't feel that far off. Some days I feel I'm on the verge of an outburst, an intervention, but I can't bring myself to do it. They're so earnest, so dedicated, almost like they're caught in the web of something larger than any of us expected. The owl has them now, and every day I wonder if, quietly, it's coming for me too. This tale is both amusing and strangely chilling. I can almost see that small green owl perched ominously, its beady gaze fixed upon every soul in your household. What began as a simple language exercise has transformed into something far grander and more bewildering, a veritable conquest of your home. The fervor for double points, the zealous scramble up the leaderboard. It is as though they are driven by an insatiable quest, each lesson a step toward some elusive victory. I dare say, should this mania persist, you may soon find them proposing to pay for supper in gems or speaking in solemn tones of league placements over morning tea. You have weathered this strange siege with great patience. Hold fast, for surely this too shall pass. Story 2. My best friend said it's either her or my partner, and I don't know what to do. It was a friendship that had felt woven into the fabric of my life, familiar, steady, and filled with unspoken understanding. My best friend, who had also been my confidant, was the kind of person who could look at me and understand exactly where I'd come from and, at times, even where I was going. She was a therapist, someone whose presence in my life I'd taken for granted as a kind of foundation, a stable rock. And so, when she told me flatly, unmovingly, that I had to leave the man I was with or lose her, it felt like a gash had opened up in a place that had been untouched until then. It began with one of those talks, the kind that started innocently and then, with a misstep or an unintended push, tumbled straight into something raw. I'd told her, cautiously, about my childhood, though she knew most of it already. The father who drank and gambled, the brother who drifted out of reach. She'd been there through the hardest parts, when I was 20, scraping together work and school, growing up in the strange quiet of a fractured family. I'd clawed my way out of it, built something that could pass as solid ground. But it left marks, scars that never really faded. So when I met my partner, I suppose I'd hoped she'd understand why he was important to me. I didn't need him to save me. I'd done the work myself. But he was steady, successful, someone I knew I could lean on if the world ever shook again. I thought she'd see that. But she only looked at me, her gaze tight and narrowed, and said I was letting my past lead me into a trap. She told me I was reaching for financial stability as though it were a life raft, and that it was a symptom of my trauma that I was with him at all. I should be with someone for love, kindness, humor. But how could I tell her that to me? Love and stability weren't separate things, that I'd spent too long clawing my way through uncertainty to be careless about it now. We went in circles, her voice cool, clinical. I felt myself flailing, trying to make her see what I needed, as if I were holding out my life like some proof. I wasn't some lost girl running toward a savior. I was a woman who'd finally found her footing, and I wanted a future that honored that work. But she wouldn't have it. And then she said it firmly. If you don't break up with him, I don't think we can stay friends. I could barely breathe. I felt as if I'd been turned inside out. How could she not understand what I was asking for? I looked at her, at this friend who had grown up with all the safety I'd never had, a father who still gave her money for groceries, an apartment she'd never had to pay for. I wanted to shout, "Of course you can afford to look at love as something separate from security." But that's a privilege I never had. I wanted her to see that we'd grown up on different soil. But all I could say was, "I don't think you understand me anymore." She left after that with a strange look on her face, almost pitying. The days afterward were like drifting through a fog, missing her and yet feeling a quiet kind of revelation seeping through. I'd spent years measuring my choices against her approval, trusting her to guide me, to mirror back some understanding of who I was. But now, without her gaze on me, I felt the beginnings of a new, hard-won clarity. The life I wanted wasn't something I needed her permission for. The stability, the respect, the kind of family I wanted to build, it was mine to choose, no matter how she judged it. There's still a sting when I think of that ultimatum, the hollow ache of losing a friend who had been so much a part of me. But maybe we'd simply grown too far apart, our lives shaped by histories we'd never been able to fully understand in each other. And as hard as it is, I'm learning that letting go can be its own kind of strength. Now I stand with a different kind of certainty, one that has its own quiet power. I'm holding on to what I believe in, not because it's easy, but because it's mine. Maybe someday she'll understand. But I'm done waiting for her to see me. This strikes to the very heart, a sorrow both profound and deeply stirring. There is a quiet tragedy in placing trust in a friend, a steadfast confidant, only to find they do not comprehend the essence of what drives your soul. To have journeyed through so much toil and pain to lay the groundwork for a life of meaning, only to feel this bond erode, is a sorrow no words can soften. Yet, there is a noble strength in your resolve, a recognition that what you seek in a partner is not mere companionship, but a shared devotion to what you hold dear. And in asserting this, even at the cost of losing her, you've unearthed a strength that no friendship can erode. Continue to trust the voice within you, for it has brought you through trials to this very moment, and it shall carry you further still. Story 3. Second thoughts. Feeling trapped in my own engagement. It was a love that had once been so full of promise. I had met him, a man who seemed to be everything I'd ever dreamed of, and for the first few years, it felt like I was living in a story that was writing itself beautifully. He was kind, thoughtful, and made me feel, in ways that no one else had, that I was seen and understood. In those early days, we were inseparable, laughing at the same jokes, finishing each other's sentences. And now here I am, 26 years old and engaged to him, with all the questions that have slowly crept in. I used to tell myself that we were only settling into the natural rhythms of a long-term relationship. People always said the honeymoon phase fades, that things start to feel different, that you have to work to keep the magic alive. So I tried to be patient, to be forgiving. But in time, I couldn't ignore the small shifts. His warmth started to cool, his kindness turned brittle. There were offhand comments, whispered things I didn't catch the first time, but that began to echo over and over in my mind. Bossy, rude. I tried to let it slide, chalking it up to stress, the pressures of work or life. But when I asked him to talk to me about it, to be open, he would shut down, turn away, or worse, snap back in anger. Tonight was a breaking point. I'd asked him, gently I thought, to please stop with the under-the-breath complaints, hoping we could talk like we once had. But instead, he exploded words I didn't recognize, sharp and unrelenting, piercing through any remnant of that old tenderness. And that hadn't been the first time. Just this week, he's lashed out like that 3 times. I'm starting to feel like a stranger to him, and worse yet, like a stranger to myself. It wasn't just words, though, not anymore. Last week, he shoved me. It was swift, a harsh twist of my arm behind my back, and he threw me to the ground. The moment blurred into tears and bruises. And then, in an almost surreal twist, he sat beside me, his face buried in his hands, crying, as if he were the one hurting, as if he were the one wounded by what he'd done. I lay there on the floor, watching him, and all I could feel was a numb, hollow ache. But telling anyone is impossible. The engagement has been announced, and I've introduced him to my family. We've celebrated, and everyone has smiled and wished us happiness. In my family's world, you don't break off an engagement once it's set. I can already hear the questions, feel the sting of disappointment, of quiet, stinging judgments. I am caught as if in a snare, wondering if I'm really to blame, if maybe I am the person he says I am, too demanding, too much. Tonight, he packed his things, left for his parents' house, and blocked my number. I keep replaying the last few years in my mind, trying to understand how I let it come to this. How I failed to see, or perhaps refused to see, what was slipping away. I find myself aching for the person I thought he was, the laughter we shared, the moments that once seemed to make the world fall into place. But as I lie here, feeling that strange quiet that sometimes comes after heartbreak, I start to ask myself new questions. I'm done trying to understand why he's changed or wondering if I failed him somehow. Instead, I ask myself what I deserve. It's such a simple question, and yet it opens something in me. I wanted a partner, a love that was safe and steady, that felt like something to build a life on. And whatever he may have been once, he's showing me, bit by painful bit, that he's not that person. Tomorrow, there will be the family, the explanations, the things people don't say out loud but hint at in glances. It won't be easy, but maybe, just maybe, it's worth the shame and questions if it means reclaiming something of myself. Perhaps the love I wanted can't be built on what remains. And perhaps, in wanting to protect myself, I am finally finding the strength to leave. I am deeply sorrowful to know you bear such a weight upon your spirit. Betrayal of this nature, when the very person you trusted begins to transform before your eyes into someone unrecognizable, is among the most excruciating trials of the heart. You have poured yourself into this bond, with all the generosity and patience that love compels, only to encounter a darkness no soul should have to face. Yet, there is a strength within you, and it shines through in your courage to place your own well-being first, even as it demands you confront painful truths and navigate a difficult path. You are right to seek love that honors you, a respect that stands unshaken, and the peace of feeling safe. May time guide you with gentle hands, and know that in choosing what nurtures your soul, you have already taken the first steps toward a life that values you as you deserve. Story 4. A Condemned Discovery. The day began like any other, slipping easily into the familiar routines of marriage. 3 years of shared mornings, a quiet rhythm we'd fallen into, unspoken and comfortable. But then, while searching his wallet for some change, something I'd done a dozen times before I found it. A small, plastic-wrapped reminder of another life. One we'd left behind long ago, a condom. It took me a moment to register, standing there in the morning light filtering through the kitchen window. We hadn't used condoms since we were married. My first thought was that it had somehow been left there by accident, something long forgotten. But there it was, vivid and real, an object that seemed to hold its own weight in my hand. When I asked him about it, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, he laughed. Probably expired, he said lightly, shrugging it off. But there was no date visible, and when I pressed him, he only shrugged again, tossing it into the trash with a swift, dismissive flick of his wrist. I wanted to let it go, to believe him, to brush off the oddness of the moment. But something in me had already caught hold of the doubt. Why hadn't I seen it before, in all the times I'd rummaged through his things? Why was it there, and why was he so quick to discard it? It seemed, suddenly, like a tiny crack in something that had once felt unbreakable. Over the next few days, that crack grew wider, though it wasn't something I could fully name. I caught myself watching him more carefully, noticing the way he spent just a little more time on his phone, the way he'd step out for certain calls. Simple questions felt like heavier exchanges, as if a new tension had settled between us that neither of us could name. I wondered if it was my imagination, if I was letting something small grow out of proportion. But then again, the unease felt as real as the memory of that glint of foil in his wallet. One night, lying side by side in bed, I brought it up again. The silence in the room was thick, and my voice seemed to puncture it, a note of tension suddenly filling the space. "I just need to know," I said quietly, "why it was there. I feel like I deserve an answer." He looked at me with a mixture of irritation and something colder. He told me I was being paranoid, that I was making a mountain out of a molehill. But his quickness to brush it away only fanned the worry. The days that followed were harder. He seemed to withdraw, to pull into himself in ways I hadn't noticed before. He left for work earlier, returned later. At dinner, there was a silence that felt sharp, a sense that something vital had shifted, as if we were two people navigating an invisible minefield. I wanted to trust him, to tell myself that the life we'd built together meant more than one strange finding in his wallet. But every time I thought about it, the questions returned, relentless and cold. Finally, one evening, with a heavy heart, I sat across from him and said I needed the truth, whatever that might be. He looked at me, his expression hardening, a flash of something I hadn't seen before: anger. Yes, but something else, too. "If you keep pushing," he said, his voice low, "you'll only make things worse. Maybe you should just let it go." And with those words, I knew there was something he wasn't saying, something that had already put a wedge between us. I'm not sure what comes next. I sit here with this quiet knowledge that I can unknow, realizing that the trust I'd once held so naturally has become something fragile. Our home feels unfamiliar now, and the man across from me, whom I thought I knew better than anyone, feels like a stranger. There are still things I don't understand, and perhaps never will. But if anything, I know that I can't ignore what my heart is telling me. I deserve to feel safe in the love I share, to trust without fear. And if he can't offer that, then perhaps it's time to leave this house of quiet, unspoken questions, to walk away and find a new beginning elsewhere. My heart grieves to hear of your struggle, for trust, that sacred foundation upon which all true companionship rests, is both fragile and precious. Once suspicion has found its way in, its tendrils are hard to silence, unsettling every quiet corner of the soul. You show immense courage in standing firm for the clarity and honesty you seek. Such fortitude reveals a spirit that refuses to be dulled or ignored. You deserve a partner who values transparency, one who meets your vulnerability with gentleness, not dismissal. Whatever path you tread from here, know that in following the voice of your heart, in honoring the feelings that rise within you, you are not yielding to mere impulse, but embracing a wisdom that few ever truly recognize. Take strength from this. Your resolve is not overreaction. It is your own spirit guarding its rightful peace. Story 5. A heartbreaking truth and a hard decision. For 6 years, I thought I knew the man beside me. My husband, 31, and I, 30, had walked together through so many small and large things, seasons of doubt and laughter. 2 years of marriage, enough time to settle into a rhythm, building what I thought was a solid, sure foundation. He had his group of friends I'd come to know as well as any other aspect of him, friends he'd carried forward from his youth. And his best friend, the man who stood by him at our wedding, seemed to me as close as a brother would be. And yet, a few weeks ago, I began to notice things, small, unnameable changes in him. Perhaps a pause, a look he gave me or didn't give me, things that came as passing clouds, as faint and then as certain as a headache you don't want to acknowledge. I told myself it was just one of those things, an effect of the day-to-day. And then, on a quiet evening when he thought I wasn't looking, I found his messages, clear and undeniable. I felt my stomach turn, a realization pressing down on me. It was bad enough to learn of the affair, to see those words in black and white, but when I saw the name of his best friend, it was as if the floor dropped out from under me. When I confronted him, he broke down. He told me through tears that he was gay, something he had wrestled with and buried, that he had hoped he could somehow move beyond. He spoke about the life we'd built together, as if it were something real, something he could hold on to. He was sorry, genuinely. I could see that he'd wanted to believe it all, wanted to believe he could live with the illusion. He hadn't lied to me alone, but to himself, to everyone around him. And that, somehow, made it hurt even more. What could I do? I listened, wanting to hold on to the sympathy I felt for him in that moment, yet I felt the edges of my own hurt rising. I thought of the house, the laughter, the plans we had drawn up with the ease of people who trusted each other completely. I thought of the small promises and how easily, now, they felt like half-truths. He asked me if we could make it work despite all of it, as if he believed we could rebuild from here. But I knew, even in that moment, that I couldn't. So I told him we would need to part, that I wanted a divorce. It wasn't an easy choice, not for either of us. He didn't ask me to stay, not quite, but he wanted me to understand, and I did, at least as much as anyone could. I didn't want to force him into a truth he wasn't ready to live, yet at the same time, the weight of it grew unbearable. Every time friends and family asked why we were separating, I found myself caught in a web of explanations that didn't fit, dancing around a truth that wasn't mine to reveal. Finally, I told him what I couldn't tell anyone else, that I needed him to come out, to be honest, so that I could have a chance at my own peace, to move forward with an honest heart. I didn't want to punish him, not for his own struggles, but I couldn't carry the weight of a life half-lived, bound by this hidden truth. I told him he deserved to live freely, but that I, too, deserved to leave this chapter without feeling as though I was shielding him from his own reality. His response was to beg me for more time, to allow him the chance to prepare himself. He was afraid, he said, of what people might say, afraid of the looks and the words and the judgments he'd worked so hard to avoid. And I understood this, maybe even too well. I could see that he was standing at the edge of something he couldn't face yet, and it softened me even as it strained me. I spoke to a few friends, to my family, about what I'd asked of him. Some understood, but others were wary, saying I was wrong to press him, that it wasn't my place to ask him to reveal himself on my terms. And I was torn, feeling pulled between compassion for the man I had loved and this deep, unshakable need for my own freedom. So here I am, with a decision I can't fully understand, but one I know I must make. I'm choosing to go forward with the divorce, respecting his need for time, even as it means carrying this quiet burden for a little longer. In doing this, I'm learning to respect my own boundaries, to honor my own grief and healing. I never asked to be part of this journey of his, yet here I am, holding pieces of both his heartbreak and mine. As I stand at this threshold, I remind myself that, in the end, we are each finding our own way forward, one step at a time. And perhaps one day, I will find clarity whether or not he ever chooses to take that final step toward his own truth. In the meantime, I am choosing myself, choosing to live in the light of what I know, even if I must hold his secret a while longer, wondering all the while if, in some way, I was wrong to want this honesty now. What a weight rests upon your heart in this tangled web of love and disillusionment, a burden so profound that it seems to touch the very depths of human suffering. I sense in you a tenderness that has borne much, a patience that has endured countless storms for the sake of love, and yet you find yourself wounded by a betrayal that strikes at the very essence of trust. In seeking clarity, a parting of clouds in this darkened sky, you do not act from selfishness. Rather, you follow an impulse as old as humanity itself, the need for truth, so that your soul might begin to mend. To long for peace is not to ask for too much. It is the cry of a heart that has given all it could. And in choosing the path of healing, know that it is not only right, but necessary, to step away from burdens that do not belong to you. May you find in the days to come the courage to put yourself first, and the wisdom to trust that you deserve a life unshadowed by mistrust. Story 6. Left alone in crisis. It began as one of those ordinary Saturdays. Our daughter, 18 months and all energy, laughter, that small determined curiosity, was playing as usual. By the afternoon, though, something shifted. I noticed it first in the way she looked at me, and then in how she began to breathe, each small breath of visible effort. The sense of unease settled in slowly at first, then all at once. I picked her up, tried to soothe her, but as she struggled to take in air, a kind of blind fear set in. I gathered her things, bundled her up, and made the short, interminable drive to the ER. It was hours of waiting, of small, coded conversations with doctors in blue scrubs, words that felt strange and detached until they weren't. Rhinovirus, respiratory distress, and in a moment, her being admitted, words that meant she wouldn't be going home with me that night. The enormity of it hit like something physical, settling somewhere deep, almost aching. I reached for my phone, fumbling to find the words. My husband was miles away in North Dakota, halfway through a hunting trip he'd been talking about for weeks, maybe months. He was hours from home, in a place I couldn't picture, and I wasn't sure yet how to tell him just how serious it was. So I kept it brief. Our daughter was in the hospital. I expected, assumed, he'd be on his way. But what came back was a casual response. Keep me posted. It wasn't that he was indifferent, I thought at first, only that he couldn't understand the severity, couldn't feel the weight of the machines and sounds around me, the cool sterility of the hospital room. So I kept waiting, hoping for the message that would tell me he was on the road. And each time it didn't come, the hospital seemed to close in around me, the silence a reminder that I was here alone, holding our daughter's small hand. Hours passed. I was updating him, of course, but each response felt emptier, more distant. And my own fear turned inward, toward this quiet, stubborn resentment I didn't want to feel but couldn't avoid. I was here, sitting in that strange hospital stillness, and he was out in some wild, quiet place, in a different life entirely. When they told me she was stable, I was relieved, grateful, really, as though I'd been granted a reprieve from a worry that could have overwhelmed me. But even as the panic lessened, something else lingered. I'd been the only one to hold her through this, to sit beside her bed, and I couldn't quite shake that bitterness. And as much as I wanted to let go, to tell myself she was fine, and that was all that mattered, I kept returning to this single thought. He could have been here, but he wasn't. Later, when I asked him if he'd come back, he was hesitant, mentioning the time and effort he'd put into this trip, as though these things somehow balanced the scale. I stood there, silent, the phone heavy in my hand, wondering if I was somehow wrong, if maybe I had overreacted. I wanted to understand him, but all I felt was hurt, and the distance between us grew in ways I hadn't imagined it could. Back at home, friends and family offered advice that only deepened my confusion. Some said to let it go, that he deserved his trip, that things had turned out fine in the end. Others felt it too, the bewilderment I couldn't shake. I was caught between them, wondering if I was right or if I was asking for something unreasonable, questioning whether my instinct was flawed. Our daughter is recovering, and for that, I'm thankful every moment. He'll be home soon enough. But I can't help this new feeling, a disconnect I can't name or ignore. I keep wondering if I'll ever feel the same way again, or if there's a part of me that will always look back at this moment, at the choice he made. It's a small thing, maybe, one moment in a long marriage, and yet it feels monumental. I had needed him here, needed him to be with us in the fear and the waiting, to shoulder the weight I was carrying alone. And now, as I hold our daughter close, I am left wondering if I'll ever truly let go of this feeling, or if it will settle somewhere within me, becoming part of our life together in ways he might never fully understand. I don't know if I am justified, but I know that it has changed something in me, that it has asked me to hold, in silence, a new understanding of the man I love. My heart aches to hear of the solitary burden you bore in that dark hour. You are not overreacting. The call to protect one's child is primal, swift as an arrow, a force that compels us without pause or question. And to be met with indifference, or worse, absence, in such a moment must have pierced you deeply, like the breaking of a sacred bond. Your pain is entirely justified, for in times of crisis, two souls bound by love should stand together, steadfast in their duty, not only to their child, but to each other. I hope that when he returns, this wound might serve as the beginning of an honest reckoning, a bridge toward understanding. You deserve to feel not as a mere companion on this journey, but as one cherished, one whose concerns and fears are met with open arms and unwavering presence. May this trial, painful as it is, bring forth the clarity and connection you so deeply deserve.